Hello everybody. In this lesson, we will study projectile motion. But first, before we look at the motion of projectiles, we first have to define what a projectile is. Think, for example, if I throw this pen, it follows a certain path. This is a projectile. So the question is, what do you think is a projectile? Based on this little demonstration, a projectile essentially is any object whose motion is under the control of gravity. Let me say that again. It is any object whose motion is under the control of gravity. Let me demonstrate this again. If I do this, the motion of the object is oblique. It follows a parabolic path. That means that the object moves in two dimensions. You have the x motion and you have the y motion. So if you look at the coordinate system, you have the x-axis and you have the vertical axis, which is the y-axis. So as the object moves in its parabolic path, its motion can actually be divided into two. You have the horizontal motion and you have the vertical motion. Now, this is important. The vertical motion is completely independent of the horizontal motion. Just this fact, which is a property of vectors, will actually help us to analyze the motion of projectiles with ease. So let's take, for example, let's start first with horizontal projection. If we have let's say we shoot a cannonball with a certain horizontal velocity v0 above a certain height h above the ground. Obviously, we know that this ball will follow a certain path as shown right here. Now, how do we analyze the motion of this ball? If we draw the ball, for example, here, the ball will have a velocity in the x direction and a velocity in the y direction. It is crucial for you to understand that the motion of this object is strictly under the control of gravity. Now, obviously, we are ignoring air resistance as well as the effects of wind. So that means that the force of gravity acts vertically downwards. This is the gravitational force. It acts totally vertically downwards. It comes with a very important implication. Keep in mind that Newton's second law essentially tells us that the net force acting on an object is equal to the mass of that object times its acceleration. So, the force in the x direction is 0. That would mean that the acceleration in the x direction is 0. This is very important. Let me say that again. Because there is no force acting on the object in the x direction, implies that the acceleration of the object in the x direction is 0. In the same manner, the force acting in the y direction is just mg. This would mean that mg is equal to ma. Therefore, the acceleration in the y direction is just the acceleration due to gravity. So it is important for you to keep in mind that the object has no acceleration in the x direction, but its acceleration in the y direction is the acceleration due to gravity. This essentially implies that the velocity in the x direction remains constant, while the velocity in the y direction changes uniformly. Now we are going to consider or talk about this in detail as we move forward. But before we move on to the next lesson, it is essential that you understand that a projectile is any object whose motion is strictly under the control of gravity. So throughout this lesson, we will look at objects whose motions are strictly under the control of gravity. We will consider objects launched horizontally. We will also look at objects launched from a certain angle V. We call this surface-to-surface projection. We will consider objects launched at a certain angle V. We call this surface to non-surface projections. And we will also consider objects launched at a certain angle V in this direction. So we have exactly 1, 2, 3, 4 scenarios to consider throughout this series. So it's actually gonna be fun and very interesting. I love physics and I love to teach, and it is my pleasure to bring you this lesson. But keep in mind, fellas, that you should remember this throughout the lessons. Because the motion of a projectile is only controlled or only under the influence of gravity, which acts vertically downwards. That means that the object only has a vertical acceleration directed downwards. There is no acceleration in the x direction. The consequence of that is that the velocity in the x direction remains constant, while the velocity in the y direction increases. If you can only remember this, it will help you throughout the next series of lessons. Thank you.